So thank you for having me and inviting me for tonight. Incidentally, this will be one of my last presentations as a director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, because I've decided to retire next year and hand over to a younger generation. After 15 years, I can promise whoever will take over, it will be much easier now than when we started, or in the, for most of the last 15 years, as I said, no one really was interested in what we were saying or what we were concerned about. And only recently, people in the last couple of years, people have begun to be concerned, mainly, guess what? Because they are realizing they have to pay for it. Simple as that. As long as it's scotch-free, everyone wants to save the planet. This is obvious. But when you really have to pay for it, you start weighing up. How much am I willing to pay? And this is what I'm going to talk about tonight, about the shifting public opinion and public mood on the policies. Not so much on the science, but on the policies. Because the science, God knows how long it will take before we know who's right and who's wrong. There are a lot of people with very strong opinions on the science. I personally are a complete agnostic on the science and think it will take at least 2, if not more, decades before we will truly understand what the science and the climate science will show us. So with that, let's look at the political, economic, and social changes that we are seeing today and how the net zero agenda is in deep crisis and in many countries is actually falling apart. And as I speak, I looked at the news today. You're all aware of the crisis of the German car industry. I'm not sure how much it affects the Dutch economy, but today the first British car factory has closed, or has announced that it will close, and it won't be the last British car factory, that manufacturer that will close. So these are the key points I will be talking about. You're all aware of the kind of protest by the farmers, by others, populist parties making a case against net zero. The European elections, which saw a kind of significant increase in voters protesting or voting for protest parties. We'll be looking at what's actually happening to the net zero agenda in Europe and how many of the plans and policies are beginning to face an existential crisis. And you may have heard about the biggest battery maker in Sweden, bankrupt. The end of the net zero consensus, what do I mean by that? Is that up until fairly recently, there was a kind of all-party consensus. All mainstream parties were basically arguing for the same policies. Some wanted a bit faster, some a bit slower, but basically in most European countries, all the mainstream parties, whether they were more conservative-leaning or more left-leaning, had an agreement that this green energy transition was the only... Oh, sorry. Can I go back? Yeah. So what you see now in many countries is, even on this issue, is our parties are beginning to split on this issue. In Britain, the Conservatives were very strong on net zero for 14 years. Now they're in opposition. Now they are very critical, which shows you, these are not principal issues. These are kind of party political issues. The victory of Trump 2.0, it's clear that he will withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement. He might actually take the US out of the UN framework of climate change, UN framework of climate change as well. Okay, people say, this will only last for 4 years and then we'll change again. Yeah, but it will slow, certainly, the prospect and will also mean there won't be much money left to splash around. China, of course, is the big elephant in the room. I will talk about the role of China and how the G7 and the EU are beginning to realize that they cannot continue with unilateral climate policies in the absence of China pitching in a big way. I'll talk briefly about COP29 and what it actually means instead of the headlines, and what I call the $300 billion confidence trick. And I'll talk about that confidence trick because people, the headlines are rich countries will spend $300 billion every year. And yeah, right. So the first thing to realize is that because of the war in the Ukraine and because of the economic problems in Europe, climate change has essentially been relegated on the European agenda. The EU's for 20 years, the climate issue was more or less the top policy agenda, policy issue on the EU agenda. This has now dropped down significantly, and the top issue is geopolitical security concerns, and you can see that the spending focus in the EU has shifted from climate to self-defense. And you will see much more of this in coming years, a lot. And Trump has said, unless the Europeans spend more on defense, the Americans will not come to the rescue. So it's quite clear that the EU and most European countries will shift more and more of their budget to defense away from the green agenda. Global backlash against climate policies, you've all been aware of that. It's not just in Holland with farmers, it's almost in every country. You have a backlash, mainly, as I said, because people are worried about the economic, financial implications of these policies. So although the populist parties have gained a lot at the European election, it hasn't actually changed European policy because at the end of the day, the populists don't have a majority in the European Parliament and the mainstream parties are sticking together. It doesn't matter whether you're right or left, they work together just on these issues and they will stick together. And in any case, who cares about the European Parliament? They have no say on these issues. It's all the European Commission, the EU Commission, so the heads of state who are having the final word. Parliament has no legal rights. The decisions are not taken, in Europe, it's not doing by Parliament. It's the leaders of the nation states, the member states, who make the final decision. But nevertheless, there has been a significant shift to populist parties, and the mainstream parties are struggling how to deal with them. They don't want to either bring them in. In some countries, they are refusing to work with them, which only increases their popularity, which is crazy, but that's how it is. There were state elections in Austria, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, and the populist party gained almost 20%. They're now almost on 40%. I mean, this is what happens if you try to outmaneuver them and try not to bring them into the tent. People get even more angry. which is nuts, but that's how it is. So that's the result. You have a backlash, they gain votes, but for the mainstream parties, it doesn't matter. They do business as usual. Of course, they will eventually have to respond to the public backlash. They will have to, and they are beginning to water down some of the policies. You might have seen it in Holland. You certainly see it in Germany. You see it in Britain. Almost everywhere, the net zero policies are being delayed, watered down, revised, because of public opposition. So what does it mean? I mean, the EU obviously has a lot of problems to face. The war in the Ukraine, an economic downturn, deindustrialization, lack of competitiveness. A lot of companies are either relocating outside of Europe or are warning that they will have to close down because they can no longer compete with competition from Asia or the US, where energy is a third of the cost of energy in Europe. So if you are a manufacturer, you do not want to invest in Europe because it does not make sense to build a factory in Europe where you have to pay 3 or 5 times more for energy than in Asia or in the US. So heat pumps, I don't know about heat pumps in Holland, but in Germany, this issue almost brought down the government, and it, in many ways, did bring it down in the end. As you know, the German government has collapsed. Mainly, most of you are not aware of that, but mainly because the liberals wanted to revise net zero policies and wanted to drop some of the policies of the Bundesregierung. And so the Social Democrat Bundeskanzler sacked him, and that brought down the German government. But at the core of the German economic and industrial crisis is the obsession with the green energy transition in Germany, which has made Germany essentially uncompetitive. Yeah, that is one of the big economic concerns in Germany nowadays, the crisis of the German car industry. They've been forced in, I don't need to tell you that, the German car industry was one of the world's leading industries on cars, and very popular cars sold all over the world. And of course, the move into EVs is something where the Germans are not the driving force and are basically trying to produce cars, EVs, that are twice as expensive as a Chinese EV. You can't compete. It's like with the solar panels. If you want solar panels in Europe, you don't get any German or Dutch or whatever European solar panel. 98% of solar panels in Europe are produced in China because they're half price. They're produced with cheap coal, so you can, energy costs are about a quarter of what energy costs are here. Labor costs are still slightly lower, so Europe can't compete. And if things go really bad in the next 10 years, we'll all be driving Chinese EVs. Mind you, most people don't want an EV. It's still something for well-off families who already have 2 or 3 cars. They want an EV just to show off that they also have an EV. Very few people have just an EV. Most people have an EV as second or third car, just to show how green we are. Yeah, and the job cuts and losses are adding up very fast. This is only happening in the last few weeks. We're talking potentially hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk if this goes bad, and the German car industry cannot produce EVs at a competitive price, and Germans are not buying EVs in the numbers required to keep the car industry flourishing. So you've all heard these stories. As I said, I haven't looked into the situation in Holland, but my guess is that if the German car industry goes down, Holland will be affected as well. So we have this crisis of the car industry, primarily because of target setting. It would have been much wiser to let the market decide on what people buy. And definitely you would have to produce EVs at an affordable cost, an affordable price for people to be keen to buy an EV. But EVs are more expensive, on average £8,000 on average more expensive. That's basically the price of the battery. So unless the industry can come up with EVs that are attractive for consumers to buy, this crisis will be existential for the German car manufacturers. Not just German, for all Europeans. Of course, one way of dealing with the problem is to put tariffs on Chinese EVs, what the EU is now doing. Problem is the Chinese will put tariffs on European cars in China, and so the Chinese market, which is huge, will be destroyed for European cars. You know, that's what a trade war looks like. And I think this latest disaster of Northvolt sums up the problem with the net zero agenda in Europe. They raised $15 billion, the biggest battery maker in Europe, and they're bankrupt. Which is all you need to know about a command and control economy. This is not based on a free market. This is based on 5-year plans, as if we don't know how 5-year plans pan out. We've had this experience for, almost 100 years. It never worked. In no place of the world do these kind of plans work. But somehow, if you color them green instead of red, people think they would work. They don't. So they've left 30 million. That's about enough to pay their staff for a week. And that's it. So they're bankrupt. And that happened last week. And of course, surprise, surprise, over this very issue, the German government collapses. Mind you, a lot of European governments are in deep crisis for economic reasons. But the German downturn is particularly worrying because of all European countries, it's the country which pays in most to the EU coffers. And if the Germans suffer, there will be less money in the EU budget, and people will ask you to cough up more. Right? You're the next. I think you still don't.
I think it's the fourth largest contributor.
Yeah, you can be the second largest now. Okay. To top the problems on the green agenda, this guy won the presidential election. And of course, everyone knows. And I read in the last couple of days that the kind of energy industry in the US said not much will change because we are already producing at top level oil and gas, which is true because even under Joe Biden, there was record production of oil and gas in the US. And this is going to continue because the US has become the biggest oil and gas exporter in the world. Bigger than Saudi Arabia and bigger than Russia and bigger than the whole kind of Middle East. And, but Trump thinks there is much more in the ground, so he's turned my old friend Chris Wright and made him energy secretary. So he's a big kind of fracking guy who was at the forefront of the shale gas revolution, one of the early guys. And I think Trump thinks he might find some more. I guess that's why but he's also someone who has been thinking a lot on climate policy, energy policy. So you can expect that the US will essentially abandon the green agenda and will focus on geopolitics and on what Trump calls energy dominance, because he thinks energy still plays such a huge role in geopolitical issues. Yeah, we all know, drill baby drill. As I said, this already started to some extent under Joe Biden. As I said, under Joe Biden, you saw record levels of oil and gas production in the US. This is just going to perhaps accelerate a little bit further. And everyone expects that the US will drop out of the Paris Agreement. They will not pay a penny into this climate fund. I think people were saying the Dutch have still some money. So I think the EU wants some money and the UN wants some money. So be prepared when they knock on your door. It's just 300 billion. I mean, it's peanuts. There's another guy with a chainsaw, I think, Milei in Argentina. Mind you, they also have a big shale deposit in Argentina. They are fracking like mad as well. So he's trying to turn this to Argentina's advantage. So he's also drilling. So you have two drillers here who are saying, the most important thing for us is economic security and national security and energy security. Now, whether this is short term or medium term or long term, God knows. But clearly, the fact that voters voted for these two guys is symptomatic of the time we live in. And it won't stay just in Argentina and the US. That's my prediction. It will catch on in other countries as people get fed up with policies that they feel hurt them. And of course, this is not just kind of the idea that it's very costly. The realization that whatever we are doing, whether it's in the EU or in the US, is actually futile if the rest of the world doesn't follow. So here you can see CO2 emissions, in the United Kingdom, the world leader, right? We are the world leaders in climate. I mean, our CO2 emissions are ridiculous compared to China's. The same with Europe. But now look at the next graph. The Chinese have emitted more CO2 in total than the whole of Europe, in the whole of history. So if you are really concerned about CO2 emissions, you have to accept that China is one of the perhaps one of the biggest emitters, right? Sorry. And not only that, but soon they'll even come close to the US, which is something. So what does it mean? It means that the current situation where China is seen as a developing nation that has a free ride, doesn't have any obligations, any binding targets, any contributions whatsoever, can't go on. And even the EU and the G7 have begun to realize that. Okay, we all know about China being able to produce everything for half the price, basically. You know, they have the cheapest energy in the world, which is coal, plenty of it, and they're using it. And they're powering their industries and their country on coal, primarily. Of course, they have some oil and gas from the Middle East and so on, but mainly it's coal because they are sitting on coal and it's the most secure form of energy for China. So they are basically dominating the solar panel market. 98% of solar panels come from China. And sooner or later, a big chunk of our car market will be Chinese as well. Here you can see what happens if you decarbonize unilateral, if you do it and the others don't. Here is the retail electricity prices in the EU, in the UK, in Japan, and then compared to China and the US. There's no question that lower energy makes your economy more competitive, right? In the US, the reason why they have cheap energy is mainly shale gas, which is very cheap, which is about, as I said, a quarter or even less than gas in Europe, and it's coal in China. So they have a huge competitive advantage, massive. And the result, what's the result? You look at this chart and you see how the percentage of our global GDP has shrunk from nearly 30 to 70, almost half, right, in the last 40 years. And China's has, from almost nowhere to almost overtaking the Europe GDP, right? So we are declining rapidly. China is growing quite significantly. The US, interestingly, you see the downturn up to 2010. Guess what happened in 2010? The shale revolution, cheap energy. What happened? When the shale revolution happened in the US and the gas price dramatically dropped, most countries, including China, most energy-intensive companies moved to the US and built factories in the US because it's the cheapest place in the world to produce energy-intensive products. So there's a huge reshoring into the US. Remember, the US in the late 1990s was so concerned about natural gas running out. They were saying, we're running out of natural gas, that they built all these ports, LNG ports, to import natural gas, right? To import, because we're running out. And they spent hundreds of billions building these LNG ports around the US, and now they are exporting this stuff. Yes. Not least to Europe, but to anyone who wants to buy some cheap gas. Yeah, right. Which brings us to the COP, the recent COP. And of course, we all wonder what's going on. What are they negotiating about? And we know that it's always about the money. That goes without saying. But But how did this pan out, and how should we read the result, the agreement, the COP29 agreement? So the NGOs and the Green Movement and some of the kind of developing nations, they asked for trillions, not billions. So in other words, currently there's a UN climate fund of around 100 billion per year. That fund runs out next year. After that, there is no more money in the kitty. And so that had to be replaced with a new fund, and the NGOs and the developing nations and China and India and Russia. And so they said the West, or the Dutch in particular, should put some new money in the UN kitty. So trillions, not billions. That was their demand. Some people said, okay, 5 trillion per year, that would be, I'm sure you'll find some. Come on. India and China ask rich nations for trillions. Of course, it's also a stick to hit your competitors. You are naughty, give us some more money. And of course, basically that was COP29. It was all about trillions, not billions. So how did the G7, the Europeans, the Americans deal with that? How did they deal with that? Right. So they offered first 200 billion, and then there was a big uproar, and people moved out of the hall, and and then okay, 300, right? The Dutch will pay up. 300 billion annually, but by 2035. So we'll have by 20. Now, the headlines were in all papers, rich countries promise poor countries 300 billion every year. That was the headline. Success. Developing countries said, oh, this is peanuts. We wanted 1.3 trillion, not 300 billion. That's, not enough. But in actually, if you look at the small print, and that's what I'm going to do, this is just a numbers trick, a money trick. What does the agreement actually say? Well, first of all, the EU said, Western governments have thus far refused to publicly disclose a dollar figure that might find acceptable for the fund, okay? And then it says, they argue that China, oil-rich Gulf states, and others newly wealthy countries should also help to fill the pot, and say haggling over final number is premature until the donor list is settled. Okay, so the question is, who is actually paying into this fund apart from the Dutch? Right? Who else? Who else? Okay, here's the agreement. And very clever. Very clever. What does it say? It says, okay, we affirm Article 9 of the Paris Agreement and decide that the developed country parties, that's you and some others, right? So the developed parties, they will take a lead. They're taking a lead. Basically taking a lead in raising funds, at least 300 billion per year by 2035 for the developing nations, right? So it's good. So for a start, you're taking a lead in trying to raise 300 billion. Great. From a variety of sources, public, private, bilateral, multilateral, alternative, printing money, they take Bitcoin, whatever. But here, what is interesting, paragraph 9, it says, encourages developing country parties, that's the Chinese basically, right? To make contributions, including through South-South cooperation and on a voluntary basis. So it's not legally binding, it's voluntary, but, and here's the thing, unless they cough up, that means less for you, but more for China, unless they come up with money, the G7 countries will not pay into this fund. How do we know that? Here. G7 to demand wealthy developing nations pay up on climate change, right? So in other words, the official policy by the G7 and incidentally by the EU is that unless China loses its developing nation status,
Correct.
there will be no money.
Correct. They're free riding.
They are, and the West they are obviously close to, being, they're heavily indebted, let's put it politely. But unless the Chinese and the Saudis and the Russians put money into that 300 billion coffer, there will be no money. Mark my words. So, and I come to the final point. What's the way out for the Dutch and the Europeans, right? How do you manage not to spend 300 billion every year on your competitors? Well, simple. You make your policies, your greenhouse gas targets, your climate finance conditional on the other big emitters contributing at the same level, legally binding. Whether your government will do that is another issue, and whether the EU will do that. But my guess is that they will. At least on the finance. Not sure about the targets, but on the finance, it's clear that both the EU and the G7 will not pay into the UN Climate Fund unless the other big emitters start paying in. Thank you very much. Apparently there will be some questions, so unlikely. They said, China's kind of spokesperson said, we will always be a developing nation. That's the official China position. We will always be a developing nation. Why would they give up something where they can free ride? Why? It's unlikely. Mind you, they do have a much worse energy security problem than the US. I mean, the crazy thing is, if you think about it, if you look at North America, which is Canada, the US, and Mexico, it's the biggest place of energy sources in the world. Forget the Middle East. In North America remain the biggest sources of oil, gas, and coal, by far. Do you really think these nations will give up these resources? Highly unlikely. Chinese are not giving up on coal. It's the only energy security they have. There's no other energy security. They're not going to power China on wind and solar, no matter how much they actually do build up wind and solar. So what we are seeing is a real reality check. Despite all the kind of utopian plans over the last 30 years that you can power a country on wind and solar and renewables can power a whole, what we're seeing is a return to energy realism where the security of resources and the price of energy is more important than the climate agenda. So, in short, I don't see China suddenly saying, oh yeah, we'll join you and don't you worry, Dutch, we'll pay up for it. You're right, absolutely. You have to differentiate between climate policy and green policy. If if you mean with green policies, environmental policies. Yeah, oh, no, two different issues. So if I used the word green, that was the wrong word and misleading, because I am talking about climate policy, not about environmental policy. Good point. Well, I'm pretty sure that nuclear is the future. The question is an economic one. There's less opposition now than there was perhaps in the early days of nuclear energy, thankfully, but nuclear is still very expensive and very complicated and regulated and so on. So it takes a long time to build nuclear power plants, although apparently the South Koreans can do it in no time. But there will be a nuclear renaissance, I have no doubt. That there needs to be some change to the over-regulation of nuclear energy, which raises the cost. It has to be built faster. We have some terrible white elephants in Britain. We've got one nuclear power plant being built that will cost 100 billion at the end of the day, which is crazy. So, yeah, nuclear certainly has a big, bright future, perhaps also the small modular reactors, if they work well and are more acceptable to the wider public. So I don't doubt that we can actually decarbonize the economy, but it's a question of the time frame. We almost certainly won't be doing it in 25 years, that's for sure. So we might need more time, and we might also need cheaper forms of low-carbon energy. And we actually published a paper on that trajectory from natural gas to nuclear, and that is a bridge, and no one knows exactly how long this bridge is, but I think that will eventually be powering many countries. There is enough natural gas, and there is the potential to actually power countries primarily through nuclear, but the price has to come down. It's still too expensive. Yeah, well, what can I say? I didn't make the decision. The irony is, in Britain, we are sitting on huge, enormous shale basins that are 10 times deeper than the average shale basin in the US. So in the US, the average shale basin is about 300 meters, and in Britain, it's a kind of 3,000 meters. So the resources are enormous, but because of local opposition, we are not fracking. That might change if energy costs are too high and that the public opinion changes, as it does, occasionally. Other countries have still big gas resources. So there is still plenty of gas around, even in Europe. Of course, there is and has been a campaign to shut down not just coal, but also gas and oil. And it's almost uneconomic to try to apart from in the North Sea near Norway, which is a very green country, as we know. But as far as oil and gas is concerned, they're very keen to get it out of the ground, and they'll continue with that. So some countries are more grown up than others. I don't know exactly the situation about the Dutch gas fields, but it certainly has reduced the production of natural gas in Europe, which is bad in general. Parties will win and others will lose. One thing seems to be fairly certain. There will, despite whatever the German public will vote for, the populist AfD will not be in government. So the Christian Democrats are most likely to form a government either with the Green Party or, if that's not enough, with the Social Democrat. So it will be business as usual. There won't be any change. And so, as I said, like in Austria, eventually people will be so angry that whatever they vote, it will always be the same, that the populists will only gain more votes eventually, which is the opposite of what the mainstream parties actually want, right? They think that by excluding them, instead of bringing them into the tent, keeping them out, they can somehow manage them, but that's not the way it works. I mean, when the Greens, when I was young, the Greens were mainly very, very left-wing, right? Now they're only the left-wing, but they were very, very left-wing. And the Social Democrats formed coalitions with them, which led to a split within the Green Party and the left, the radical left, essentially left, and the Greens became more mainstream. So they became more integrated. And my view is you have to do the same with the populist right. You can't just forever isolate them because it won't work, and voters will become more alienated. So, but it's not going to happen in Germany, obviously. So my guess is there will be a grand coalition between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. But who knows? Well, there is a general problem with the money spent on developing budgets and climate budgets, in the corruption and the lack of transparency where this money goes. And perhaps an even bigger problem in that a lot of that money actually doesn't go to African countries. They go to European or Western companies building wind farms or solar farms or whatever, and say, look, this is our contribution to climate change. It's not as if these billions are spent to make life easier for developing countries. It's mainly spent on technologies or energy forms. Very little of that money will go into adaptation. So you have a problem with that. The best policy, you see, and the irony, I mean, I made that point in the film Climate the Movie. You may have seen it. The Europeans are telling the Africans, do not burn oil, do not burn gas, do not use coal, because that is damaging to the climate. But can you sell us some? Because we're desperate, we need gas and oil. So at the same time as they are telling them not to use fossil fuels, they want to buy it off the Africans because obviously they have a problem with the Russians, right? So this kind of craziness and schizophrenic policy, that on the one hand, and the other thing is they're saying, well, if you do use oil and gas, we will put tariffs on your products. So they are taxing the Africans on their food because they're using oil and gas, and putting this carbon border tariff on African farmers' products. So that's what I'm saying. From a purely ethical, never mind economic point of view, it's absolute madness, and also completely hypocritical. On the one hand, they're saying, don't use oil and gas. On the other hand, please sell it to us, because we're desperate, we need more oil and gas. It's a general, I mean, where should I start? So this is a problem all governments face. In the US, it's a little bit easier because you can sack the main kind of civil servants and say, we're a new administration, and you can recruit people who are more like-minded and so on. In Europe, it's much more difficult because civil servants are almost forever. You know, once you recruit them, you can't sack them, essentially. Particularly when they fail, then they will get promoted and so on. That's issue of bureaucracy and different, that will take generations to sort out, unfortunately. And by the way, it's not just the civil servants. I think the political class, even whether it's right-wing or left-wing, they have a habit to stick more or less, not to rock the boat. It's not like Trump, okay? He can basically say, well, and even Trump will struggle, but believe you me, even he will struggle to actually fulfill his pledges and so on. Because we're talking about modern government, modern bureaucracies who are huge, and institutions. You can't change that within one general election. So there will always be that problem of inertia I mean, Milei is trying that. He's the first one who's actually trying to deal with that. I mean, how does he do it? He closes down all these departments. We don't need this department, we don't need that, and this can go, and this can go. And I don't know how many departments he has closed. But the departments that still exist, I'm pretty sure they face the same problem. So that is I can't really tell you what the answer to that problem is. The problem is that whatever government is elected will be blocked, hindered, slowed by the bureaucracy, whatever name you call it, the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is inherently, I wouldn't call it conservative, but inherently trying to avoid change as much as possible and just to do what they know best. That's modern life, I'm afraid. I have no bloody idea. I always say, as far as I'm concerned, if you look at the last, let's say the next 10 or 20 years, temperatures either go up, or they go down, or they stay the same. But if you ask me what is the likelihood of these three possibilities, I have no idea what. It would assume that I know how the climate works, what policies are being adopted, what technologies are being invented. All I know about the people who are making claims about global cooling is that I've heard that for 30 years, and it hasn't so far happened. And they've made predictions like in the next 5 years. So that has never happened, which makes me wonder, what do they know? I don't know. Or what do they know to make these kind of... So let's put it this way, I'm skeptical about all predictions of what the climate is going to do in the next 20 years. As far as I'm concerned, I haven't got a clue. The most intelligent people over the last 100 years, some of the most intelligent, were socialists. They believed that socialism would outperform free markets. They believed that for the very end. They've never changed their mind. The fact that the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore is not because people suddenly say, oh yeah, I think we made a mistake, let's no, the system was essentially overthrown by a public revolt. Just because you're intelligent doesn't mean that you actually understand the economy. Most people don't. And the most intelligent people don't understand the economy. Also, a lot of intelligent people are very, very narrow-minded. They don't want to listen to other views. That's the problem on both sides of the debate, by the way. Then the narrow-mindedness, the dogmatism that you think you know all the answers. Most politicians do that. Most people do that, incidentally, not just politicians. So this inability to actually listen to other people's views and say, okay, let's think this through. Could there be perhaps something about this? Let's weigh the arguments up. Let's weigh the data up. Very few people have the time, the patience, or the willingness to do that, which is why most people are very dogmatic. Left, right, and center. So when you talk about politicians, they do believe what they're saying. They do believe it. It's a belief. It's a belief system. Like socialism was a belief system. Or like people believing that there is no climate change, there is no global warming. It's a belief system, right? You have to weigh up the evidence. You have to weigh up the data. You have to listen to people who have a different view to your own view. And most people, it's a tricky thing because people feel much more secure if they have a strong view, one way or another, which is part of our society's problem. I don't think that the electoral system is the problem. I think that's actually a good thing. That you can basically chuck out governments you don't like or don't deliver. That's a good thing. The problem is not our democracy. The problem is and in West now more so than ever before, the polarization, the unwillingness to engage in a proper, serious conversation with people who have other views. That is the problem we are facing. China has no future as a dictatorship, let's face it. No dictatorship has survived over long periods of time. They might survive, a generation, 3 generations, eventually if they cannot deliver. And this is how economies work. There is no guarantee that economies will always flourish and that will always have, everyone has jobs and that's not how economies work. They have cycles. They go up and down. And when they go down, people want to chuck out governments. And a democracy guarantees that you are able to elect someone else. In a dictatorship, that's not possible. So I'm not entirely sure that what you're saying, that democracy is a problem. It's our inability to actually come to better policies that make our lives better and our kind of welfare system more secure. I think that is the problem. And that is because we've become such a polarized society that we don't no longer listen to each other's view. But we haven't been listened to for, as I said, 15, 20 years. And as a result of not having a proper discussion, we are in this serious crisis because we've run into everyone, in one direction without asking questions. I don't know enough to say anything about thorium reactors. What I do think is we need much more competition within the nuclear industry, much more, because that's the way of innovation and bringing down the cost. And any energy sector like the nuclear, who for decades has relied on government subsidies and handouts, why should we invent or innovate? We get the money anyhow. So once you get support from the government, there is less competitive pressure to innovate, bring down the cost, come up with new technologies. And that's part of the problem with the nuclear industry, and of course, problem with the renewable energy anyhow, because they are also pampered by all these subsidies. So once you rely on governments to support you, you stop innovating because you're happy. Oh, lots of companies profit, but these are mainly either companies that get subsidies or are providing products that are being part of a 5-year plan or net zero plan. Again, there are a lot of environmental technologies that are extremely helpful. It's different to energy issue here. We're talking environmental or technologies that help the environment. That is completely different. We're talking about energy forms that are relying on government subsidies. We saw that with the battery factory. That's just the tip of the iceberg, that something that the public doesn't want to buy, either because they don't need it or because it's too expensive, that will not survive contact with reality. So innovators have to think about, and this is the problem, once you don't have a market anymore, because the government decides what they want and what forms of energy they want, you undermine the pressure and the dynamic of an innovative society. And you have a society where people bargain for, give me some subsidies, or I will provide you with X amount of wind turbines for X amount of money. And that makes, the price higher for consumers and the government. So that's the green growth is I'm not saying all aspects of the environmental industries are affected by it. Some are doing very well, but on the energy issue, they are not. They're not, unfortunately. And that's the realization that it's actually making life more difficult, A, in stabilizing the national grid, and B, in raising the cost of energy as well. I mean, sooner or later, I fear rather later, people will say enough is enough. We can't go on digging a deeper hole, right? So it all depends on whether or not the energy policy and the climate policy will make life more difficult for people or will relieve people's living standards. My fear is that the current policies are detrimental to our economy, are detrimental to our well-being, and that the people will eventually go against it, if that doesn't change. Eventually it will change. Everything eventually changes. Even the worst, dictatorship eventually goes, and the worst policies will be changed, and you adopt and you change and turn it around. You see, as I said, what happens in Argentina. No one anticipated that. A country with one of the worst rates of inflation and economic concerns. You can turn things around, and I'm not even saying that he will be doing that, but he's trying. So in the short term, I'm afraid it will get worse before it gets better. And how long that will take, I don't know. We're still blessed with fairly high living standards, but if our manufacturing industries go belly up, as I fear they might, things will deteriorate quite quickly, I'm afraid. So, well, it depends. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there is a risk that much of our manufacturing base in Europe will increasingly become the little that is still here will, and we will have to rely on imports. So I'm not optimistic that the current path of policy will actually lead to some kind of stabilized economy. I can't see that. I think what is most likely going to happen, that policies will be watered down, will be kicked into the future. They will say, okay, well, perhaps 2050 is too short, too little time. We might have to do this over longer periods of time. It also depends a little bit on what the climate does, right? If we, let's say in 10 years' time, not much has changed, then people will say, well, what are we talking here about? But if the kind of IPCC predictions come true, and we pump enough CO2 in the atmosphere, and suddenly temperature not dropping, accelerate. If that happens, of course, then the politics will change. But my concern is that the current way that Europe has adopted almost unilaterally will be abandoned. And there will be growing number of governments around Europe saying we have to slow down, we have to revise. I mean, today, the news in the UK is they are giving up the EV policy for 2030. That's because, why? Because the car industry has said, if you don't give this up, we'll have to close down. As I said, one has already announced today that they're closing down. And other factories are saying, if you don't change, we cannot continue. So I guess change is on the way, but it will be a long and drawn-out process. There is no easy answer to this problem, I'm afraid.
That was a little bit less hopeful than I was hoping for. But thank you very much, Benny, for this talk.